Welcome back to our continuing journey through Muhammad Ali Amir-Moezzi's groundbreaking work, The Divine Guide in Early Shi'ism. Today we're diving into how the early Shia community dealt with problematic hadith, those hadith that seem contradictory, where the Imams appear to be contradicting themselves. Amir-Moezzi reveals that ilm al-Hadith, or the science of hadith in early Imamite thought, is genuinely original, and it is nothing like the methods of the Sunni school. It is rooted in a completely different understanding of religious authority and the nature of the Imam's knowledge. We'll also be looking at a pivotal moment in Shi'i history, the era of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam, when the oral tradition of the Imams were systematically committed to writing for the first time, producing what became known as the 400 original books. So let's begin with a question that might seem troubling at first. What do you do when the Imams contradict themselves? In any religious tradition that relies heavily on transmitted teachings, you inevitably face a challenge. What happens when your sources seem to contradict each other? Sunni Islam developed elaborate methodologies to deal with this. They created complex sciences of hadith authentication, looking at chains of transmission, the reliability of individual narrators, and various technical criteria to determine which hadiths were authentic and which weren't. But the early Imamites approached this problem from a completely different starting point. They weren't primarily concerned with authentication in the way Sunni scholars were. Why? Because for them, the Imams weren't just reliable transmitters of the Prophet's teachings, they were themselves sources of divine knowledge, inspired by God, possessing what we might call a living, ongoing revelation. So when faced with what they call ikhtilaf al-Hadith, divergence of traditions, the Imamites developed a sophisticated framework based on two interconnected concepts, NASKH and TAQIYYA. NASKH means the concept of abrogation. Let's start with NASKH, or abrogation. According to the Imam's own teachings, the principle of abrogation operated on multiple levels. A verse of the Quran could abrogate another verse, or it could abrogate the Sunnah. Similarly, one prophetic tradition could be abrogated by another prophetic tradition. Or, and this is crucial, it could also be abrogated by the traditions of the Imams themselves. Now think about what this means. This isn't just saying that the Imams can interpret or explain the Prophet's teachings. This is saying that the Imams possess an authority that can, in certain circumstances, supersede earlier prophetic traditions. And it goes even further. A later Imam, what the sources called a lahiq, or succeeding Imam, could abrogate the words of an earlier Imam, the sabiq, or preceding one. An Imam could even abrogate his own earlier statements. Now the second concept is even more interesting, and it's one that's been widely misunderstood, taqiyya. If you've encountered this term before, you've probably seen it translated as dissimulation or tactical concealment of one's beliefs. And yes, in the later periods and in certain contexts, taqiyya did come to mean something like that, the permissibility of hiding one's Shi'i identity under persecution. But in the early corpus, taqiyya also meant something much more specific and profound. It meant the keeping or safeguarding of the secrets of the Imam's teachings. And this isn't primarily about political survival, it's also about the esoteric nature of the Imam's knowledge itself. Listen to how Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam himself explains this, and I'm quoting here from the Hadith. He who is certain that we, the Imams, proclaim only the truth, may he be satisfied with our teaching. And if he hears us say something contradictory to what he heard earlier, he should know that we are acting only in his own interest. Do you see what's happening here? The Imam is saying, trust us completely. If we seem to contradict ourselves, it's not because we are wrong or because one statement is inauthentic. It's because we're teaching different things to different people for reasons that only we understand. And then in the end, it is all about preservation of our wilaya, which is the most crucial and critical doctrine for your success. This reveals something profound about early Imamite epistemology, their theory of knowledge. The Imam's teachings isn't conceived as a single uniform message that's the same for everyone. Rather, it's understood as a multi-layered wisdom that must be carefully disclosed according to the readiness and circumstances of the recipient. Some teachings are for the masses, some for the elite, and some for particular circumstances. This is why, as Amir-Moezzi points out, the early Imamites didn't develop the same kind of technical criteria for hadith authentication that the Sunnis did. They were working from an entirely different paradigm. The question wasn't primarily, is this hadith authentic? Because if it came from an Imam, it was by definition true. The question was rather, what is this teaching really saying and to whom is it addressed? Now let's turn to a pivotal moment in Shi'i history, the Imamate of Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam, which lasted approximately from 733 to 765 CE. The systematic recording of the Imam's traditions in writing appears to date only from Imam Ja'far's period. Before this, the tradition was primarily oral. But from Imam Ja'far's time onward, we see an explosion of written documentation. The evidence for this is compelling. First, all the traditions in which disciples are expressly instructed to write down the words of the Imams come from Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam. Second, almost all the authors of what became known as the 400 original books, the Usul al-Arba'iyya, were disciples either of Imam Ja'far himself or the Imams who followed him. Now you might ask, why then? Why did Imam Ja'far alayhi salam initiate this move from oral to written transmission? This is where Amir-Moezzi's historical analysis becomes really illuminating, because he shows us that Imam Ja'far's decision was shaped by a very specific and dangerous political context. So let's set the scene. We are in the mid-8th century. The Umayyad Caliphate, which had ruled the Islamic world for nearly a century, is collapsing. The Abbasids managed to seize power. And they did so, ironically, with the help of various Shi'i groups who hoped for a more favorable regime. For Imam Ja'far alayhi salam, this period of chaos was actually an opportunity. He managed to maintain political neutrality throughout these upheavals. The Abbasids, initially at least, were too busy consolidating power and fighting other threats to focus on the relatively quietest Imamite community that Imam Ja'far alayhi salam led. But here's the problem. Other Shi'i groups weren't so quietist. During Imam Ja'far's own Imamate, we see a series of armed revolts by different branches of the Shia. All of these revolts were brutally crushed, and this created an existential threat for Imam Ja'far's community. Even though the Imamites weren't participating in these rebellions, they were still Shia. They were still seen as potential threats by the authorities. And the danger of collective punishment or reprisals against all Shias was very real. At the same time, the sheer volume of traditions had increased enormously during the Imamates of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, Imam Ja'far's father, and Imam Ja'far himself. There was simply too much to preserve through oral transmission alone. So we can hear the urgency in Imam Ja'far's appeals to his followers. Listen to these statements that Amir-Moezzi quotes from the Hadith. Imam says, "Write our traditions and communicate your knowledge to your brothers. At the time of your death, leave your books to your sons, for the time of calamities will fall upon those men who have no other companions but their books." And again, Imam says, "Preciously guard your writings, for you will soon have great need of them." The tone is almost prophetic, isn't it? Imam Ja'far seems to foresee a time of crisis when the living chain of transmission might be broken, when the Shias might not have access to teachers, when the written word would be all that remained. And his followers responded. From Imam Ja'far's time onward, disciples began systematically recording the Imam's words in writing. The result was the famous 400 original books. Now, we need to pause here and understand what these books represented. These weren't just any collection of the Hadith. These were the foundational texts of Imamite learning, compiled by direct disciples of the Imams. recording their teachings in an organized fashion. Later Imamite scholars would treat these 400 books as the primary sources, the well springs from which all subsequent Hadith collections would draw. These 400 books were preserved for centuries, particularly in two major libraries in Baghdad during the Umayyad period, when a Shia dynasty controlled Baghdad and much of Iran and Iraq. But then disaster struck. During the lifetime of Sheikh al-Tusi, anti-Shia riots broke out in Baghdad. These two libraries, Sheikh Tusi's own library, were burned. And a number of the 400 original books were undoubtedly destroyed at that time. But fortunately, all the knowledge from those books were preserved in the canonical Hadith collections that Twelver Shi'ism relies on today. Now here's where we need to confront something that you might find uncomfortable, but which is absolutely crucial for understanding the transformation of Imamite scholarship. The late canonical status of the four books wasn't just a historical accident. It reflected a fundamental shift in how Imamite scholars conceived of their own role and authority. In Sunni Islam, the 6 canonical collections achieved authoritative status quite early, within a couple of centuries of their composition. But the Imamite 4 books didn't achieve their canonical status until much later, around the 11th or 12th century. And this delay reveals something profound about what was really happening during this period. Think about the historical context. By the 10th and 11th centuries, Sunni Islam had developed a sophisticated clerical infrastructure. Sunni scholars had prestige, institutional authority, patrons, positions of influence. They had developed the science of usul al-fiqh, the principles of jurisprudence, which gave them the methodological tools to derive law through ijtihad, independent legal reasoning. They were Mujtahids, qualified scholars whose legal opinions carried real weight. The Imamite scholars wanted to achieve the same thing for themselves, but here's the problem they faced. The early Imamite worldview, as we discussed in the previous section, didn't really have room for this kind of clerical authority. Remember what we said about the early esoteric tradition? The Imams themselves were the source of divine knowledge, the axis of the entire spiritual universe. The role of their followers was primarily to transmit and preserve the Imam's teachings, not to engage in independent reasoning or legal derivation. So to create space for a professional clerical class of Mujtahids, the Imamite scholars had to fundamentally reorient their tradition. And the way they did this was remarkably straightforward. They copied Sunni methods almost wholesale. First and most importantly, they adopted the Sunni distinction between two types of hadith. Number one, the juridical traditions dealing with furu, the branches of law, practical legal rulings. And number two, the non-juridical hadith, dealing with usul, meaning doctrine, beliefs, theology, cosmology. Now, why was this distinction so important? Because it created a hierarchical division within the corpus of traditions. The juridical traditions, the furu material, was elevated as the proper subject for scholarly analysis, for ijtihad, for the exercise of legal reasoning. This was where the scholars, the emerging clerical class, could demonstrate their expertise and authority. The non-juridical material, the cosmological teachings, the esoteric doctrines about the Imams' metaphysical nature, the mystical dimensions of early Imamism, this was progressively marginalized, treated as less important, or reinterpreted through the lens of rational theology to make it more palatable. Now, do you see what's happening here? The very aspect of early Imamism that Amir-Moezzi identifies as the most authentic, the cosmic, esoteric understanding of the Imam as a metaphysical reality, is being systematically downplayed in favor of legal material that allows scholars to function as jurists in the same way the Sunni scholars did. And the canonization of the 4 books, the Kutub al-Araba, was central to this project. By establishing these 4 collections as authoritative, Imamite scholars were creating their own equivalent to the Sunni Siyah Sitta, the 6 canonical collections. They were saying we too have a defined corpus of traditions on which legal reasoning can now be based on. And how did they authenticate these traditions? How did they develop the criteria for evaluating Hadith? They borrowed directly from Sunni Hadith science. As Amir-Moezzi explicitly notes, when the Imamite scholars needed systematic Hadith criticism, they drew on these existing Sunni models. The technical vocabulary, the classification systems, many of the analytical tools, these were all borrowed and adapted with very little modification from the Sunni tradition. And think about how remarkable this is. The early Imamites had their own sophisticated approach to divergent traditions based on NASKH and TAQIYYA, rooted in their understanding of the Imams as divinely inspired sources of knowledge. They didn't need Sunni authentication methods because authenticity wasn't their primary concern. Understanding the teaching's true meaning and the intended audience was. But the later scholars abandoned this early approach. Why? Because it didn't give them what they wanted, the authority to function as independent legal reasoners, as Mujtahids, who could derive law and issue fatwas. The Sunni Hadith methodology, by contrast, was perfect for their purposes. It created a technical science that required years of specialized training to master. It established clear hierarchies of scholarly competence. It gave scholars the tools to evaluate traditions, accept some, reject others, and thereby exercise real authority over the community's religious practice. And this project was remarkably successful. By adopting Sunni methods and focusing on juridical traditions, the later Shia scholars did indeed establish themselves as a powerful clerical class. They created institutions of learning modeled on the Sunni madrasas. They developed this system where qualified mujtahids became sources of emulation for ordinary believers. They achieved social prestige, economic support, and eventually in Iran, even political power. But this success came at a cost. By focusing almost exclusively on juridical traditions and adopting Sunni authentication methods, the later tradition progressively lost touch with the early esoteric understanding of the Imam that had been at the very heart of the original Imamite teaching. The Imam, who in early sources was presented as a cosmic figure, a metaphysical reality, the axis of the spiritual universe, was increasingly reduced to a model jurist or an exemplary legal scholar. The mystical and esoteric dimensions of early Imamism were either forgotten, allegorized away, or dismissed as exaggerations and extremism. But Amir-Moezzi's research forces us to recognize that what they were actually doing was transforming Imamism into something quite different from what it had been. By copying Sunni methods to achieve clerical status comparable to Sunni scholars, they were perhaps unconsciously reshaping Shi'ism in a Sunni image. The early vision of the Imam as the living, divinely inspired source of knowledge was replaced by a system where scholars derived law from transmitted text using rational methodologies borrowed from Sunnism. The immediate charismatic authority of the Imam was replaced by the institutional authority of the Mujtahid. And in doing so, they moved progressively further away from the worldview of the Imams themselves. A worldview where, as Amir-Moezzi reminds us, the Imam was the alpha and the omega of all doctrine, not just one of these sources among others to be used in their ijtihad. Now, Amir-Moezzi concludes this section and the first chapter of the book by outlining his approach for the rest of the book. He is going to examine the Imam through what he calls three different phases: the pre-existence, the existence, and the super-existence of the Imam. This tripartite structure is brilliant because it allows him to explore the Imam through all the different modes of being that the Imam possesses according to the early Imamite teaching. The pre-existence of the Imam refers to the Imam's reality before his earthly historical manifestation. This is where we will encounter teachings about the primordial light of the Imams, their existence before the creation of the world, their role in the cosmic order from the very beginning. Next, the existence of the Imam refers to his earthly historical reality. The Imam is a human being living in time and space, teaching disciples, facing persecution, and navigating political dangers. But even here, as we will see, the Imam is understood as possessing extraordinary qualities that transcend normal human limitations. And finally, the third, the superexistence of the Imam. And this is perhaps the most fascinating category. It refers to what the Imam becomes, or perhaps what he always was, but which becomes fully manifest after his earthly life. This involves teachings about the Imam's ongoing presence, his knowledge of all things, his ability to know his followers and their needs, and his role in the spiritual realm. By examining the Imam through these three phases, Amir-Moezzi can give us what he calls a synthetic definition of the Imam, a comprehensive understanding that encompasses all the different dimensions of this central figure in early Shi'ism. Now, he is modest about his project. He acknowledges that space and time won't permit an in-depth look at all the implications of the problem, but he says we shall at least attempt to formulate it correctly. And this is characteristic of Amir-Moezzi's scholarly approach. He is not claiming to have all the answers or to have exhausted the topic. What he is doing is formulating the question correctly, establishing the right framework for understanding early Imamite doctrine about the Imam. And that correct formulation, that proper framework is absolutely essential, because for too long early Imamism has been misunderstood through the lens of later rational theology, or compared inappropriately to Sunni models, or dismissed as simply extremist or heterodox. What Amir-Moezzi is doing is taking early Imamite teaching seriously on its own terms, understanding it within its own conceptual framework, its own symbolic language, its own worldview. So let's step back and consider what we've learned in this episode. We've seen how early Imamite Hadith methodology was strikingly original, particularly in its approach to divergent traditions through the concepts of NASKH and TAQIYYA. We've explored the pivotal role of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam in systematizing the written transmission of Imamite tradition. We've learned about the Usul al-Arba'iyya, the 400 original books, and their tragic partial destruction. And we begin to understand that at the heart of early Imamite teaching stands the figure of the Imam, not just as one element among others, but as the alpha and the omega, the organizing principle of the entire worldview. This sets the stage for everything that follows in Amir-Moezzi's work. In our next episodes, we will dive deep into the actual content of early Imamite teaching about the Imam, exploring the Imam's pre-existence, existence, and super-existence, and discovering a vision of religious authority that is both profound and, for many of us, quite surprising. The Imam we will encounter in these early sources is not primarily a jurist or a theologian, though he is those things. He is a cosmic reality, a metaphysical principle, a divine light, the axis of the spiritual universe. Understanding this figure in all its complexity and mystery is the key to understanding early Shi'ism itself. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Divine Guide in early Shi'ism. I encourage you to sit with these ideas to reflect on how they challenge or confirm our understanding of Shia tradition. And I look forward to continuing this exploration with you in the future episodes. Until then, may we all be guided by the light of knowledge and the wisdom of the Imams. Ma'as salam.